Blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining me. And it's my honor today to have Father Mikhail Baleka, who I had on my podcast a couple of years ago. It's been a while. And
Yeah.
I I watched Father's YouTube channel, and I'll post the link in the video description. And he Actually, I've been reading this book for a while because someone had recommended it to me, Orthodox Psychotherapy by I'll let you handle that one, Father.
Um,
Metropolitan of
Hierotheos Vlachos of
okay,
Nefpactos.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, no
And so
worries.
yeah, so I've been reading the book, and then I noticed that Father had recorded a podcast about it. So I thought, well, I'm going to ask him because I've been wanting to do one on it too, because I really like the book. So thank you, Father,
Oh, my
for
pleasure.
joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you again, Joseph. I enjoyed our last conversation. I'm sure this one's going to be just as much fun and
Okay.
hopefully informative for anyone watching.
Hope so. I've also been reading this book, Wounded by Love by Saint Porphyrios. Porphyrios.
Yeah. Great
Ah,
saint either way.
yeah,
He won't
yeah,
mind.
yeah. And I just wanted to open up with this because I thought this was pretty interesting. I'll give you guys page numbers so you can. This was page 153, and he wrote. When a person lives without God, without serenity, without trust, and with anxiety, worry, depression, and despair, he develops physical and mental illnesses. Mental illness, neurosis, and split personality are demonic states. Wow. Okay.
It's a lot to unpack from that, right?
Yeah.
Especially because,
Yeah.
there are so many people who struggle with things like that, right? With split, maybe feeling like, well, not necessarily split personality
Yeah.
always, but sometimes maybe feeling like there's an identity issue within themselves, or neurosis is a really common thing, especially as a priest. You see it a lot in confession, especially amongst a lot of young men.
When I first read that, I was like, whoa, but I read it to another priest friend of mine, and he helped me a bit. And I think it is true that a lot of mental illnesses, there's a spiritual aspect to it as well. I think nowadays people have focused like solely on like if there's a physiological cause, like I have like a hormonal problem, or I have a chemical imbalance or something.
Yeah.
And people forget that there's also a spiritual dynamic to I think all physical ailments, but including mental illness. I think there is.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, a way to even look at it is that sometimes we have to remember that God always, as is written in Scripture, he desires not the death of a sinner, but that all should repent and come to Him to live and have eternal life, of course, because He is the life. So, of course, if you're with life eternal, you will live. Um, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that sometimes God will permit for the bearing of these crosses as a means of purification based off of of course, the fact that He is all knowing, and He can very well easily know the kind of struggles we'll have, and the disposition that we're coming into the world with, or that we will obtain. And so He will give us the tools, the best tools necessary to help us to be purified, to grow closer to Him, to grow in holiness. And one thing, if anyone is watching this and has, mental health issues that they've been experiencing that are either physiologically caused or maybe are the byproduct of a circumstance, don't lose hope. I'm sure as the talk goes on, you'll see there's actually a lot of hope in realizing this, and in seeing the therapy that can be obtained, of course, only in Christ as a holistic approach to healing.
I agree. Now, this book is over 300 pages, so I've only got Father here for a limited time. So I tried to sort of focus on like one aspect that I found interesting, and on page 47, I thought this was kind of a cool quote. So he wrote, now, in order to be cured, it is essential to feel that one is ill. When someone who is sick is not aware of his illness, he cannot turn to a doctor. Self-knowledge is one of the first steps to a cure. I think that was really interesting. And I found,
Yes.
yeah, one real quick, Father. I found this quote. I'm already aware of this quote. I've got like lots of quotes from Orthodox saints and different people, and it reminded me of this one from Bishop Ignatius. Another name I have a hard time. Brian.
Brian Chanonov.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you.
It's a tough one. That one was tough for me for a while. I had to get Father Vladimir to help me with that.
They're all bad for me. And he said, "We are all in deception. The knowledge of this is the greatest preventative against deception. It is the greatest deception to acknowledge oneself to be free of deception." So I kind of saw those two things as kind of related about deception
Yes.
because I think a lot of people, like he said, when someone who is sick is not aware of his illness, he cannot turn to a doctor. I think a lot of people are deceived, and I kind of wanted to get into one group that I feel like is deceived, that people are deceived and they don't even realize that they're ill or sick.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing that we see because obviously there
Yeah,
are people who can have physical ailments and not be aware that they are suffering from something. They might just think it's
correct.
something minor or inconsequential, and unless they kind of key into the fact that wait, something's not right, and they actually pay close attention to it, not necessarily in an obsessive and neurotic way, just kind of acknowledge like, okay, this is not quite in the norm, and that enables them to go to a doctor to receive treatment. And so, the understanding uh, the church as being the right faith, as the Orthodox Church having the correct deposit of faith, that its theology is true, is ultimately saying that its understanding of God and how to worship Him and how to be united with Him are true and correct. And this is why I believe he says this later on, I think close to this page, where he says that, of course, if we lose the theology of the church, we lose the therapeutic method.
Yeah.
And St. Ignatius highlights it beautifully when he says that the greatest deception is to be convinced that one has no deception. Um, that at that point, that's where we become so unaware, so lacking in watchfulness in our lives that we're not necessarily noticing all these other sins coming into our lives. And that's usually, as a priest, what I see is usually when somebody will come to confession and they won't confess their sins, they'll confess everyone else's sins around
Mm-mm.
them, or they will confess their sins, but they will attach either overtly or covertly the blame for their sin on someone else. And that's where we start to kind of develop this split-mindedness to our spiritual life, where we think, well, yeah, I have a problem, but it's the problem is really external to me. It's not my problem. And so, if we don't take the therapeutic tools given to us by the church, namely in this case watchfulness, which of course we should always be using the light of the Gospels and the words of the saints to examine ourselves and to see where we're lacking. I believe it was Saint Yusim Popovich who said that when we read the Gospels or the Scriptures in general, we should read them with our life. We should read them against our lives so that we can see whenever Christ talks about a sin in the gospel or an imperfection that needs to be perfected, that we see ourselves in this and we don't immediately have our mind go to our neighbor.
Mm, mm, Yeah, I think with mental illness too is I think people are deceived because I think they they just think of themselves as well. I think they're deceived too by the current state of things, how they are. People don't think they're sick, and they've been deceived, so they don't even realize it. I mean, for me, I remember for a long time, I didn't realize how like spiritually sick I was, and that caused me to be so mentally sick. But I just thought that what I was doing was okay. So realizing that what you're doing is not okay, and then it's caused you to have like bad thinking or a bad mental state. That's important when you finally figure that out.
Absolutely. I mean, your soul,
Yeah.
at the crux of it, right? Your soul is your life.
Yeah.
That is what animates you. What, you're as a man, as men, we're mortal, rational animals, right? Meaning, as Saint John of Damascus would put it in his philosophical chapters. And that's because we are animated by a soul, right? We have a rational soul. And the danger is that when that soul starts to suffer the spiritual illnesses, and of course the soul in man is spiritual because not only is it immortal by virtue of it being spiritual, but for the fact that being created in the image and likeness of God, man's soul is capable of faculties that move beyond what is just base or animal, right? We're capable of love. And a lot of the time you'll find in certain mental illnesses, the ability to get outside of oneself is lacking.
Mm,
And that's oftentimes the cure when people are neurotic or where they're paranoid and self-obsessed. You'll usually notice that everything centers around themselves,
mm,
and they have a hard time getting their minds out of themselves. They can't pray for anyone, or they struggle to pray at all because this is something external to them.
yeah.
But then everything they start to suffer with in terms of scrupulosity is a view of God that is inconsistent with the truth of God revealed in scripture and in the lives of the saints and the tradition of the church. And actually, usually the way that they fear the judgment of God is more so how they are judging themselves and everyone else around them.
Mm, mm. This is from page, 110. I think in this paragraph, he quotes a lot of saints. I think he's quoting St. Gregory of Sinai here. But he says,
Ladder.
when man leaves his senses free, and through the senses his nous pours out of his heart, then his soul is taken captive. The unloosening of the senses lays fetters on the soul. This bondage is equivalent to darkening. The setting of the sun creates night, and when Christ withdraws from the soul and the darkness of passions lays hold of it, then the incorporeal beasts tear it to pieces. Man's soul falls into impenetrable darkness, and the demons work on him. He finds himself in a moonless night. That's a lot. So the
It's a lot.
thing, yeah,
It's
the
like,
things
wow.
that fascinated me is you see, I mean, I've noticed it because I have, where's my quotes here? I've got some quotes here. I've always been interested in the idea of slavery and bondage as related to sin.
Mhm.
That imagery has always interested me because I think it's very true, and he uses that here, so I picked up on it. But he also talks about the passions, and I think the passions have a lot to do with sometimes the cause of mental illnesses. Let me just read a couple of quotes here, from
Absolutely.
two other Orthodox people that sort of are on this same page as him. So this is from Father Seraphim Rose, who of course is my favorite. And he's talking about sexual freedom. He says sexual freedom is the coupling of words that represent totally incompatible realities. Since sex
Mhm.
practice today is slavery, is but another instance of that postmodern incompetence to do anything but follow one's passions and accept whatever vulgar slogan justifies its aims. And then this is from St. Justin Popovich. In truth, there is only one freedom, the only freedom of Christ, whereby he freed us from sin, from evil, and from the devil. It binds us to God. All other freedoms are illusionary, false, that is to say, they are all, in fact, slavery. That sounded like what Father Seraphim just said. And then this last one from Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov. The world has proclaimed the reign of freedom, especially of late. But what do we see in this freedom of theirs? Nothing but slavery and self-destruction. So when Father in the book mentioned this, used this imagery of bondage, and I thought, well, that sounds very familiar because other people have talked about that too. And I think the passions, especially in terms of, I think the sexual passions can really enslave people. And I think it can cause mental illness. And I think that's why
Absolutely.
a lot of people I think are really struggling now because I think they're ruled by their passions,
Absolutely.
and I think it's not healthy, it's not normal. And as Father Seraphim said, it's not the way things are supposed to be. And I think it can drive you crazy. So,
It can actually. I have a an
sorry, Father.
article. No, no, you're right though. Like
Okay.
I'm actually really loving that you're bringing all of this up, and I
Okay.
like especially with the quotes from Father Seraphim because he's kind of an expert on this. And
Yeah.
if anyone who's read about his life and his
Yeah.
conversion, and if you haven't,
Yeah.
you really should, and you'll see what Joseph and I are talking about.
Yeah.
I have an article coming out soon. I'll talk about it more once it's published. I think it just finished being edited. Um, but I have an article coming out soon actually about this called How to Endure Hardships
Wow.
and Win. And actually, this is something I found very poignant to talk about, kind of with the neuroticism and actually it's interesting that you mentioned this about how the sexual sins, especially these days, and how people get in bondage to them, and this can drive them crazy because there's actually, in terms of just raw on the secular level, there's more and more proof coming out to back up what the church has long taught about this, and that is that it's not only psychologically damaging in the truest sense of the word, that it will damage your psyche, your soul, but that it's actually even physically damaging. And it's, things like pornography, which are just, as Father Seraphim Rose beautifully called it, is the devil's iconography. And I think part of what's really important to understand why he says that, because some people think this is just inflammatory language to make a strong
No,
point or
no.
pietistic fear mongering. It's really not. Um,
Mm-mm.
icons, the church's understanding of icons is hominidic, meaning that, it has for its cause the prototype. So if we look at the saints, the cause of their holiness is Christ. And so, in some way, we can say that ultimately, even an icon of a saint is depicting the glory of Christ in one's life and what
Mm,
it leads to.
mm,
And so, when we venerate that saint, we're still venerating God in return because they're only a saint due to God's energy in their soul. I think that
mm,
later on in that page that you quoted, Metropolitan Euthymius quotes Saint Hezekiah, the priest from the Philokalia, when he says that man becomes unsettled when he loses the energy that is the operation of God in his soul.
mm,
And what's really interesting in this, because a lot of people, again, they don't realize that because of the nature of what pornography is, it does bear in effect its relationship to the devil. Now, ultimately, adultery, fornication, the cause of this spirals out from the fall, which of course was initiated by the temptations of the evil one. And so he naturally has dominion over this. And when we look at what an icon is and how it allows us to relate to something holy, something beautiful, something good, this stuff enables people to relate to and connect with things that are the antithesis of that. It's the absence of chastity, it's the absence of respect, of love. It's truly the fullest expression of self-worship when people indulge in this. And that's why, even with a study done by a doctor by the name of Dr. Patrick Fagan, he said that he called pornography a quiet family killer because his
mm.
study found that 56% of divorces had at least one partner with an obsessive addiction to pornography.
Wow, the guy.
Yeah, usually the guy.
Yeah.
I Unfortunately, it's becoming more common among women, and the
Well,
danger with this is now this is creating, in both men and women, a false expectation of what intimacy in marriage looks like, and they
yeah.
become bound to this, right? So it's and there's even been neurological studies that have said that individuals who get engrossed in things like this or games online,
Mm,
that certain pathways in their brain are triggered in the same direct and intense way that a drug addict's brain is affected. And you can even see this in how the baseline dopamine levels are affected in addicts for both internet gaming or pornography and even cocaine. There is a similar correlation to the effect that way. And so it, and ultimately we see this as caught up in self-love, which St. Maximus the Confessor says is the highest form of insanity.
well, I also don't think it's a coincidence that, I mean, there's always been mental illness, but, but there's been such an epidemic of it following the sexual revolution, like clinical depression, which nobody had ever heard of. Um, because the so-called freedoms that so many people have been given hasn't caused really happiness. It's just
No.
caused a lot of like confusion and death. So this is on page 134. And he wrote, since evil thoughts come from the passions, the guarding of the noose begins with self-control and food and drink and rejection of all kinds of evil thoughts and Hezekiah of heart. The guarding of the noose is combined with watchfulness and the Jesus prayer, because there is no progress whatsoever in guarding the noose without watchfulness, humility, and the Jesus prayer. Father, for non-Orthodox, and most of my listeners are non-Orthodox, what's the noose? What is that? I know it's a lot. Could you just tell people
Absolutely.
quickly what it is?
To kind of break it down for the non-Orthodox viewer, the nous and Hezekiah or Hezekiah
Yeah.
is two things. So Hezekiah refers to stillness. It's a stillness born of peace. We have, for example, Hezekiastic saints who were totally dedicated towards achieving this sense of inner stillness in their hearts. What the nous is, in terms of older terminology in English and drawing the terminology from Latin, which has had a profound influence on the modern English language, the nous is what we might call the intellect.
Mm,
So it's that higher apprehensive, receptive function within man that not only enables reasoning, but obviously the nous is kind of like the gateway to the heart in this sense. Now, the heart is the essence of the man. Some sources will say that the nous is like an energy of the heart or of the soul. But the
mm,
best way that I've seen it described is it's like the eye of the soul, or it's the intellect. It's that part that receives. And when it comes to guarding this, is we have to be able to set up kind of an internal defense system where, especially like if you're having an issue with an addiction or with any vice in your life, this is something that you have to have some awareness of, that whatever you see, whatever comes in will impact the nous or the intellect. And you have to be able to establish a protocol for keeping certain things out and knowing how to separate the temptations and the urges from needs. And of course, how to separate tempting thoughts that might come your way that not necessarily are coming from your own thoughts. And you have to learn to separate yourself from those things. You have to learn to see your identity as being separate from what tries to enter into the intellect or to the nous.
yeah. That line is important because this line is really important. It's on page 135. It's on the bottom of the page and it goes over. We see clearly that a noose which is freed from enslavement, there's that word again, to the senses by silencing the lips and suspending external stimulation becomes the regulator of the soul. It does not allow putrid and satanic thoughts to enter the depth of the soul, but good thoughts which nourish and give life to man are permitted to enter. Thus, all the conceptual images and actions of someone whose nous is the ruling emperor are pure. So this is important because again, he uses that that imagery that I talked about, but you can't underestimate the power of our senses and what we allow in, and well, what he's saying here, what we should not allow in. And
Absolutely.
I don't think people realize that. This is going to go to the next point, which I think is really important. It, it People underestimate the power of what we allow ourselves to see, hear, and experience. So,
That's so true. That's right on point with that. And I mean, it's neat because it kind of lines up nicely with a quote from Saint Joseph the Hesychast in Monastic Wisdom when he talks about how we have to maintain the purity of the noose because it's like the rider on the back of a horse, right? The
mm,
rider, we mustn't dismount it, otherwise the horse is going to go out of control, right? Um, from the article that I wrote, the to kind of clarify just one point further for anyone watching who's not familiar with these terms, the intellect in this regard, the nous, is not to necessarily be confused with intelligence.
mm,
Intelligence describes that receptivity through that faculty, actually, and that's why we admire intelligence, because intelligence in all reality usually goes hand in hand and should be seen as going hand in hand with temperance and prudence. So it's oftentimes we tend to think of intelligence in the way that we would describe someone being smart. They're very good at recalling details or spitting out information that they've previously absorbed. That's not what the intellect serves. It's meant to be what we use to guide and govern the inner principles of our life, right? It's borrowing a bit from the Stoics. There's this book by Pierre Hadot, which for anyone who's maybe getting into this kind of way of looking into it, that might be a good entry point if, because the spiritual aspects can sometimes escape people in Orthodox theology because it's very lofty. But the inner citadel is kind of what we're talking about with this. It has to serve as a means by which we weaponize and direct our convictions, right? Like we have to have a conviction to have freedom from this bondage. We have to have a conviction in our soul. This is something St. Theophan the Recluse says in The Path to Salvation, that we must have a conviction in our souls that is the antithesis to the thing we're struggling with. And we have to have that conviction so that even if we fall into that sin again, the conviction strikes us so hard that we are more determined to turn from it each and every single time. It has to be there kind of like a shield and buckler against the flaming arrows of the temptations that come our way.
Mm, mm. That's important. This is probably, I hate to say my favorite part of the book because it's it's tough, but I think it's the best part. This is page 165. Gosh, I got a lot of quotes here. Okay,
It's so good.
I got a lot of notes. Okay. This is sickness of the heart. So he uses, see, I'm drawn to this imagery. He's using the imagery of captivity and slavery again. The devil enters the heart of man and takes it captive. Here he's quoting scripture. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. No doubt his news had been in captivity for many years before this. Just as it is impossible for fire and water to pass through the same pipe together, so it is impossible for sin to enter the heart without first knocking at its door in the form of a fantasy provoked by the devil. This he puts, I think he's quoting Saint Hezekiah the priest. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
Saint Hezekias. Yeah, he's in the first volume of the Philokalia. Really, he's one of the Neptic fathers who wrote extensively on watchfulness.
I love them. And then Father bold-faced fantasy. This is really important. Fantasy is what leads the devil's provocation into the heart. In fallen man, fantasy, which is more subtle than thought and coarser than the noose, is the beginning of evil. Wow. Therefore, the fathers advise us to keep our fantasy pure or better, to live in such a way as not to activate fantasy. This is super important. So I found, I get real excited about this stuff. I found this quote from Elder Paisios, and he said, demons have their own specialization areas. They tap a person to find out where it hurts, seeking to identify his weak spots and thus to conquer him. I think this has to do, it's also related to the idea of fantasy. Because I think
Yes.
when people get into that, I think they expose a lot about themselves that that's not a good idea. Because the devil isn't omnipresent or omniscient, omnipotent, but he's a good observer, and the demons, they're bored,
And they
so
got a way better network than Facebook or Twitter. Like these guys can communicate instantly. So,
exactly. So they watch man and they watch you, not you, Father, but
oh yeah, I mean, they watch all of us. They definitely watch me too.
but they watch who's listening and they watch me. So I think through fantasy, I think people give a lot away about their weaknesses, and that's not good.
Yeah,
And
basically.
sorry, Father. And
Oh,
I
that's
think
okay.
certain people are especially prone to this world of fantasy. I think people that have been hurt, abused, abandoned, neglected, tick all the boxes, especially kids nowadays. I mean, I grew up a kid that was exposed to pornography young and abused, and that's bad. The average age of kids being exposed to porn nowadays is 11 years old, which is sick. Well, it's never a good age to be
Wow,
exposed to that, but that's really bad. And I think
it's
people that,
dangerous.
yeah, I think people that are prone to fantasy, like I said, are often abused, and then they're also prone to mental illness. So I think there's a certain community that has this issue that I used to belong to, and they're very much tied in with the idea of fantasy. That's why they're so obsessed with things like Disney and entertainment and music and those things. If you just look at modern music nowadays, it's like satanic. So
Yeah.
fantasy and all those things, boom, 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 hit you.
Yeah, those Taylor Swift concerts get pretty wild if you're able, if you're even able to remember them. So,
I wasn't thinking of her, but I was thinking of some other people.
I
But
remember reading an article about them. Like, this is a strange phenomenon, where some of these people are coming out in large numbers saying that they can't even remember half the show that they went to. It's like,
seriously,
yeah, and there's some pretty overtly satanic images on stage there
really,
with
I didn't
her.
know that about her.
Yeah, yeah, my wife had actually shared with me an article on that, and because we were kind of talking like, we got to be aware of these things, especially because we have a boy and a girl, and we're expecting a third kid on the way, due on April 20th, Pascha, so I get to celebrate the resurrection and the birth of my third kid. Um, but you know,
She could definitely be like a gateway drug to,
yeah, and a lot of that that's what fantasy is, because that's to clarify for people, like things like fantasy, like if you like Lord of the Rings or whatever, like that's okay. The problem with engaging in fantasy on the level that Joseph and I are talking about is when this starts to become the governing principle that you want to shape your reality around. And we're not even talking about taking allegorical or thematic lessons from things like we see in mythology, or in tales like C.S. Lewis's Narnia or in Lord of the Rings, and taking these thematic moral elements. We're meaning when you want to live in a reality that is not congruent with the reality you live in. And when the saints say this, when they say that, it's from the provocation of the devil, that's where the temptation is first. The danger with the fantasy is that is the beginning of the mental ascent to that temptation. So that image, that thought comes into your mind, wouldn't it be nice if, or wouldn't it be great if,
that's it.
name whatever passion, say with an alcoholic, wouldn't it be great if I could have another drink? And usually they start remembering how good it feels to have the drink.
That's
They
it.
start thinking about their pain going. Maybe they're going to get that nice hit of dopamine because it does affect the dopaminergic system. And then before you know it, the craving intensifies. And now that it's more than just a temptation, it's an inflammation in the soul. And the person desires this and feels that their very well-being becomes dependent on it. It's the same with when people struggle with temptation of pornography. They could have an image enter into their mind. And the moment they start trying to undress that image or play around with it and fantasize with it, they get swept away in it.
Yeah.
So,
It's also related because when you're talking about fantasizing things about what could be, because people start thinking about maybe I'm gay, or maybe I'm born the
mm,
wrong sex, or then you get other people where it even gets weirder, where like there's this stuff called otherkins, where they believe that they're like other things. And I wasn't really aware of this
mm,
stuff, but it's thought of this stuff as like connected to like anime, where people get into this stuff like really hardcore. I know that sounds like the extreme, but
yeah,
I think people can. I mean, there are people that the with that whole anime stuff, people take on like a different like
like a new
not
persona.
a character. That's it, persona. That's it. That's
Yeah,
it. And they have like conventions and stuff. But
yeah.
people can do that too. I did that as a kid, where it's like, well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe this, maybe that, maybe this. And then one day you kind of go, oh yeah, it's true.
Yeah, because you try to reconcile that internalized desire for a
Yeah.
certain reality, and you try to superimpose it onto the reality you're
Yep.
living in. And
Yep.
and that's the danger, right? It's because we often then start to try to attribute our identity to things that are outside of ourselves. And that's very dangerous. Like your identity can, to a certain extent, be attributed to things that are not natural to you in the sense of goodness,
Mm,
right? Like there's a reason why
mm,
Jesus says there's none that are good but God. If good was intrinsic to human nature, and
mm,
this is a little bit of philosophy, but if good was intrinsic to human nature, we wouldn't need laws. We wouldn't need things to govern and guide and steer towards what is considered good, right? There would be nothing for it to rotate around. It would just be an arbitrary designation of what is good. And so when we start looking at what makes a person good, it is a struggle to achieve something outside of themselves, right? Like a virtue. And it's okay to have a role model, whether it's like, say, a fictitious character, you're like, I like how that virtue is depicted in this person. I'm going to work harder to be honest, or I'm going to work harder to struggle more, or I'm going to, do things to not give in to my weaknesses because I
mm.
want to
Yeah,
embody and characterize that strength. But when it becomes, I want to be that thing, that person, you're now wanting to move beyond what is attainable to you.
yep, yep,
And the danger with that is that then you're going to have to start reshaping your own reality and changing who you are as a person to fit that idea. And then to go around and expecting other people to just love you when you can't even love yourself
that's it,
in a healthy way.
that's it.
um, it's not consistent with reality. Typically people who are good at garnering respect, first and foremost, have some kind of respect for themselves. They respect their time, they respect their bodies, they respect what they put into their minds.
Yeah.
And these are usually like nobody thought, oh wow, look at that guy. He has no self-control. I want to be just like that. Nobody thinks that way. Oh wow, that guy's a loudmouth and never shuts up. I want to be just like him. It's no, we always admire people who characterize a form of strength that says something about their virtue. And that's because in all reality, these virtues, they come from God, right? And I think in all reality, it's a desire to have that connection with Christ, with God, with
Yeah,
something better than you, and
yeah,
to obtain to that in some small part that is lost a lot of the
yeah.
time with these people. And I think a lot of them must have an incredibly empathetic capacity, and it's been abused.
That's it. Yeah.
It's been abused by the world and by people who exploit that. And so I think a lot of these people, to be fair to them, are probably deep down very good people who are yearning to be good, to be loved, and to do good and to give love, but it's been distorted by these things that these coarse ideas. I love how they say it's coarse, and it kind of like grates against the soul, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not
Yeah.
going to fit into your reality. You're never going to be that thing, but you can find a way to be a better you. And you can find a way to obtain those things which are able to be taken into you as a person: goodness, virtue, honesty, right? Self-control, courage, wisdom, selfless love. These are things that you can obtain through trial and error and pain, but they can be yours. But you'll never be I don't know, like what is another kin? You'll never be like you're never going to be a star child or whatever, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Or a unicorn.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
you don't have to be. You can
Yeah.
be you and realize that the way that you live virtues,
Yeah.
that can be unique. Like look at all of our saints. They're all very unique, but yet you see one consistent thing. They're plugged into the same reality. They're plugged into that consistency.
I think what you segued for me. You set it up for me. Perfect, Father. But I think a lot of things that are actually mental illness have been normalized in this
Yeah.
culture recently. So this is back to Saint Porphyrios. Man, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Saint
Sa-
Porphyrios is a it's
Porphyrios,
I did not even
Porphyrio,
know how to say his name when I first became Orthodox.
Porphyrios.
Yeah.
Sensitive, because I think a lot of people that are prone to mental illness, and I think you just said it, are actually sensitive people.
Yes.
And I think people that oftentimes are abused are often sensitive people. Um, I think they're easily preyed upon. And
Yeah,
he wrote this:
absolutely.
sensitivity cannot be corrected. It can only be transformed, altered, and transfigured so as to become love, joy, and worship. How? By turning upwards, by turning every sorrow into knowledge of Christ, love of Christ, and worship of Christ. You said this before, I think. I was interested in this word upwards because I know because I used to be in like a fantasy world of like sick perversion. And I think it's often instead of turning things upward, it's turned inward. And
Yeah.
I think that's bad. I mean, it's good to be introspective to a point, and I think this goes back to Father's point about fantasy. I think when it's too much in here, when people are too much in your head, that's a bad place to be.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, you got to
yeah,
kind of move upward and outward, right?
yeah,
Like, it's, the higher faculties of the soul are to know and to love. And ultimately, the whole aim of this is to know God in order to love God and to be united to God. But this also applies to each other, right? This is why Christ commands his apostles to love one another as he so loved them. And when we get trapped in our own fantasy worlds, the problem is that that love becomes directed solely to the self, and yet again, it's what's called a mindless passion by Saint Maximus, because self-love will never be able to be properly reciprocated, and at the end of the day, it'll only ever be self-serving, so it can't be love. True love is to will the good of another. It's to give of oneself, whether it's the kind of love you have for your family or for your friends, for your spouse, for your children, right? These kind of loves have to be external, and human beings need that external relation. I mean, there's a reason why we live in communities. There's a reason why isolation, unless you're like a super holy hesychast, is not good for you. And even then, they still will get together and have communal worship and commune on the body and blood of Christ together. Um, but you need that feedback, and you also need to give something back in order to be able to actually have that healthy sense of who you are. And I think a lot of the time the danger is that sometimes people identify themselves so intimately with the mental illnesses or the emotional pains that they're struggling that they don't know where the illness or the pain starts and where they begin.
exactly.
So,
This is on page 232. I think this is really important. Thus, the passions develop in man's soul and create terrible problems in his whole being. According
yeah,
to the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas, someone who loves wrongdoing hates his own soul. He tears apart and disables the image of God that is his soul, and he suffers in a way similar to the mentally deranged who cut their own flesh to pieces. This is really important. I mean, there is sort of a phenomenon of cutting that people have, but
yeah,
I think but see, this is where it goes back to mental illness has become normalized. I think there is something like body dysmorphia or that it's so much in this culture where either through I know so many people have tattoos and I have them when I got them in my
yeah.
past, but
Hey, same
pe
here.
people tattoo themselves, people pierce themselves, people do all these body modifications to themselves. And I think that's what he's talking about here is that way before there was any thought of this crazy stuff, is that this manifestation in the head um, becomes apparent in the body.
Yeah. I think a lot of that comes from kind of like getting paralyzed in one's fantasies. And that's oftentimes, I think, where the neurosis kind of comes into play. Um, it's the danger with this is that when people get caught up in their endless loops of self-pity, or the misguided belief that the issues they face are uniquely terrible, uh, it can allow us to create a bunch of excuses, and oftentimes we'll then attack the most immediate thing we can that is personal, and that's our body. And so we start to kind of disassociate with it, and we go, oh well, that's not my face, or that's not how I want to look. And a lot of that comes from jealousy and insecurity. Um, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, if you're overweight and you know that this is bad for your health, okay, well, do what you have to get help to lose weight, but don't get to the point where then it's not something you can stop. Or, if you have to gain weight, it's the same thing. Like I've dealt with a lot of guys who, so, at one point one would assume that body dysmorphia and kind of body image issues were more common amongst women, but I'm finding it's
Mm,
becoming more prevalent amongst men these days,
Hmm.
where I've known many young men who have abused steroids and
Wow.
have created a lot of health problems. There's that one really popular influencer who is like a bodybuilder or something.
Oh, was
He
that
was like,
a Liver King or something like that?
no, younger than him. I think his name
Oh,
was it was Joe something.
oh, I don't know.
Really young guy, obviously in good shape, but at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. And he did have a tragic and sudden end in the form
Oh,
of a brain aneurysm. And a lot of the time, uh, issues can happen with the bloodstream, with the heart, um, when somebody's abusing these kind of things. And a lot of this is done to pursue an image that has now not just become a thing for their own comfort, but now the source of their livelihood. And we can see where this can lead to a very dangerous and destructive end.
hmm.
It's not normal for a guy in his early 20s to meet such a sudden and tragic end that way, and to leave a hole in the lives of those that knew him. And that's the danger as well with body dysmorphia, is that it's ultimately a disassociation, not just with your body. You're not like a soul trapped in a meat suit. It's a disassociation with your very personhood, because you're a body soul composite. You're an embodied soul, or an ensouled body, if you will.
Hmm.
There's an intimate relation there, that you can't be born in the wrong body. Who you are as a person, the moment you come into being, your body is a part of that being, a part of that experience of your very being. And the hypostasis, the person themselves, is the basis for the existence of both their relatively immaterial soul. And I say relatively because in philosophical talk, to imply materiality can either mean gross matter, like, my shirt or my skin, and but it could also mean just the point in time in which something exists and doesn't.
Hmm.
And so your soul comes into existence with your body. And it's a part of that vital thing. It's the very thing that gives your body life. So you can't be born in the wrong body, any more than your body has the wrong soul. It's just not possible. You have to
Hmm.
be able to embrace whatever struggles you have, whatever difficulties or disabilities, and realize that these can be things that you can turn around to make you a stronger and better person, and that God doesn't make mistakes.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a lot. Talking with people that have been abused, a lot of times, not all obesity because it's such a problem in the United States, but I did
Canada
notice
too.
that, a lot of people with that, oh boy, a lot of people with that issue is often like building up like an armor because they're trying to protect themselves. There's that issue. But then I've noticed a lot of times, a lot of people have, it's kind of a cliche, but a lot of people have like a hole in their heart. And sometimes, food is a way to people fill it with other things, shopping or drugs or porn or gambling or whatever. And some people
Yeah,
try to do it with food. So it's this problem here, but it's ultimately here, it affects your whole body. It's bad. So
exactly.
this is page 248. It is true that the passions of both body and soul are hard to discern. This is because the demons who stir them up are usually hidden, and man cannot distinguish them. See, this is important too,
Yes.
because it people, I think, are deceived. It goes back to that quote that I read earlier, is that the I don't think that all mental illness is caused by some sort of demonic influence, because I think some people there's something genuinely wrong,
Oh yeah.
probably with their brain.
Yeah,
But
neurological disorders and
yeah,
different kind of imbalances, or even damage to certain parts of the brain, can certainly look like what you might think is
uh,
demonic in terms of possession, but can
yeah,
actually, like, for example, with schizophrenics, they often get misunderstood as being demonically
true,
possessed. And
true,
sure, you could argue that demons, for one, to kind of clarify maybe some myths about demon possession,
yeah,
a lot of people think that when somebody's demon possessed, it means the demon has somehow possessed their soul.
yeah,
And that's actually not the case. The demons are unable to possess the soul. Um, They're creatures comprised, now they're hylomorphic in the Aristotelian sense that they're form and matter, meaning that they're confined to time and space. They can only be in one place at one time. And they can occupy a physical space and manipulate the matter within that space, which includes a person. They can manipulate their brain, they can manipulate their body, but they can't actually touch the soul. The schizophrenic, a lot of the time, the issues are biological. I mean, for example, a lot of the time, schizophrenics, especially ones that might be more prone to violent outburst and hysteria, are oftentimes prescribed drugs that suppress and act as an antagonist to dopamine
Mm.
because they have such an excess of it sometimes that because dopamine actually plays a role not just in kind of the reward and feeling good about things, but even with movement and energy. And so they have an excess of that, and that can sometimes drive the delusion and make them more crazy. So yeah, not everything is demonic, but a lot of the time the demons will still take advantage of that and then try to drive the person into depression or despair or suicide, you know.
And that's demonic. I wanted to
Absolutely.
share my screen real quick with you, Father.
Oh
I've
yeah, that'd be
I've
great.
had I've had you here for an hour. Uh,
I've got the time.
okay. I wanted to talk about this a little bit too, because I think a lot of people have been deceived. This is a subject that's important to me. This is from the American Psychological Association. What causes a person to have a particular sexual orientation? There's no consensus among scientists. No
Yeah.
consensus. So not necessarily born that way. I don't
No,
I don't think it's true.
no,
No,
it's
yeah.
yeah,
Why, but why is there, because this is a podcast about mental illness. Why does this particular group of people have such high rates of mental illness? Despite the Netherlands' reputation as a world leader with respect to gay rights, this was the first country to legalize gay marriage. Homosexual Dutch men have much higher rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and suicide attempts than heterosexual Dutch men. Why?
wow,
Why?
I mean, first off, that's really sad.
Yeah.
I mean, the high rate of suicide. I mean, and as a priest who's had to counsel families and people who
Mm.
have either thought about suicide or who've gone through with it, um, stuff like that should really unsettle people and make you think, let's find for a cause. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that,
It doesn't, Father.
yeah, it's, there's no way that you can ignore a correlation. In fact, it's foolish to ignore correlations and just say, well, they're unrelated. They're related. There's obviously, it's a lack of fulfillment when it comes down to it. Um, when you even look at the kind of studies they've done to show the increase of depression amongst men, for example, who struggle with chronic masturbation versus men in healthy relationships with their wives, um, there isn't a proper feedback loop
Mm.
that happens in these kind of engagements when they have these relations with each other. And we have to understand why, because ultimately what's happening here is just the pursuit of personal pleasure.
Yeah.
And the problem is it's like we talked about earlier. If you can't get outside yourself, you will become depressed because human beings do have that higher faculty to love, which is supposed to be the willing of the good of another. But for obvious biological reasons, there isn't a simultaneous, release of endorphins happening, the way it does in a heterosexual relationship. There's not something that can come out of it, something beautiful like a child, where now you are further pushed to take that love to the next level and love not just beyond yourself when it comes to your spouse, but beyond each other towards that child. Um, Ultimately, I'd say this is revelatory of what we would call maybe the appetitive powers of the soul being inflamed against the cognitive powers of the soul against good
Mm.
counsel. And so when we see these higher rates of mood disorders, anxiety, of course, we could try to say, well, maybe there's bad family dynamics there. In fact, in most cases, there is bad family dynamics that drive these kind of cases that drive men to
Okay.
either commit suicide or that drive these kind of relationships.
Yeah.
And I think it's to me, it's really it's on the nose when it comes down to this that it comes down to not being able to control the fantasy. and having to try to project it. And when that fantasy consistently isn't being fulfilled or, accurately lined up with the external reality, the desire to quit the game, so to speak, jumps up and pushes people over the edge.
Yeah, gets worse. Let's
That's,
see.
oh, let's see more. Yeah, like that's
And
so sad.
this
God
is
help these poor people.
suicide in married couples in Sweden is the risk greater in same-sex couples. So the
Wow.
so for a time the thinking was that, well, let's allow homosexuals to marry and a lot of these things will clear up. Among same-sex married men, the suicide risk was nearly threefold greater as compared to different sex married.
Wow.
Whoops, whoops, didn't work. So
Wow.
that's because there's another problem here.
Hmm.
Mental health of non-heterosexual population of England. Self-reported identification as non-heterosexual was associated with unhappiness, neurotic disorders, overall depressive episodes, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, phobic disorder, probable psychosis, suicidal thoughts and acts, self-harm, and alcohol and drug dependence. I wonder why.
Yeah.
Suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and non-suicidal self-injury among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and his heterosexual. Oh, this is Australia. The other one was UK. Sexual minority participants were at greater risk of suicidality and self-injury than heterosexuals. Okay, here we go. This is the problem. Comparative data of childhood and adolescent molestation in heterosexual and homosexual persons. 46% of the homosexual men, in contrast to 7% of the heterosexual men, reported homosexual molestation.
Wow.
That's the problem. And see, that has to do with self knowledge and deception. And here, Father, on page 255, and he put it in bold. Self-knowledge is needed, first of all. It is very important for us to be aware of our spiritual condition. Ignorance of our illness makes us permanently incurable. St.
It's
John the
true.
Evangelist writes, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. And I'm not saying these people, because I used to be in the same boat as these people, but I'm just saying that they've been deceived and then you start self-deceiving yourself.
Well, and I'd even say they've been exploited by a system too.
Like with
It's kind of enabling and perpetuating the pain that they're in order
yeah.
to what? To get money off of more therapy sessions or gain money off of medication and writing prescriptions. It's,
Mhm.
you have to question this. And I'm not saying that that's the motive. I mean, there's lots of good therapists out there that truly just want to help people. But I think when we are disengaging with reality and we're enabling these kind of things and normalizing them, we run the risk of normalizing the mental illness to the point where it flies under the radar. This becomes a person's day-to-day existence. And when it becomes too much, they choose an unfortunate end, and that's to end their own lives, or maybe even to end the life of another and then themselves. It's really tragic.
Yeah, on that particular issue, there are like very few good therapists because what they'll have people do, because they can't deny that group of people has high rates of mental illness. They just can't deny it because it's like right
It's
in front
there.
of you. The sky is blue, you know, and they can't deny it. But then they'll say, oh, it's because the way you were raised. Your parents were too religious and they made you feel guilty. And that's why have mental illness. You have all these problems. Or, something with, how society treats you, you feel discriminated against. So that's why you're having these problems. Now, they don't ask people, see, they won't ask people about trauma in childhood because then it's like, oh, well, what caused it?
Yeah.
You weren't born that way. It's like trauma. See, they won't do that.
Oh, exactly. It's not, I mean, even just on a purely biological level, nobody's born that way. There's a reason why, um, reproduction only happens in relationships with males and females, and that is just because on a genetic level, on a purely raw biological level, and on a philosophical level, you know, there are essential differences in nature, but that nature has to be propagated through the interaction of male and female. And so you can't argue that it's a natural thing or that there's a genetic predispositioning towards it, because then what are we going to argue? There's a genetic predispositioning towards people who are pedophiles, or men who beat their wives, or men who beat their children senseless. Because then at that point, where does the ethical boundary apply either, right? So we have to look at what is causing the traumas, like you said, and address them. And that's where the lack of watchfulness in modern society has really shown its ugly head. And we see now that it's not so much the illness that's actually being treated at the source, but essentially just a form of pain reduction. And then at the end of the day, the Tylenol is not going to make the gangrene go away. It's not going to make the infection go away, right? So it's like it's
It,
not going to take the pain, right? Like you can numb it, you can try to shut off your pain receptors for a bit, but until you remove that cause, like for me, it's a funny kind of physical example. I had this brutally ingrown toenail for years, and I would get parts of it cut out, but it had to be cut out down at the root because it kept
mm,
coming back. And when it would come back, it would get worse. It would grow faster. It would grow right into the flesh. Got to the point where every step I took was causing me intense pain for I don't know how long. I recently
oh,
got the thing lisectioned out, and all of a sudden, it's like, oh, I can walk now. Like the pain is
wow.
gone. Like it's healing. And it's kind of like this with any mental emotional issue. If you don't get to the root of the trauma, if which even the word trauma means wound. Well,
That's
what's
it.
wounded? This is why we call it psychology, the soul. What is the soul? It's that interactive principle, the very source of life within you. Your mind is a power of the soul. Your mind is not your brain, right? Your brain is the organ, the intermediary that your mind uses to interact with the rest of the physical world you live in. And
Yeah,
we have to realize that you can't blame everything on your brain, but you can blame everything in terms of what you do on what you choose to do with your time. And
exactly.
so if you're not spending the time trying to get better, you're wasting your time. Because in all reality, this is what your whole life's purpose is to be at the most fundamental, accessible level to everyone. Your life's purpose is to become a better person day by day through struggle. It doesn't happen any other way. It's one thing to talk about virtue. It's another thing to be about virtue. There's a really good quote from a Stoic by the name of Musonius Rufus. Um, I'll just see if I can pull it up here so I can remember it. That basically what he says is that it's one thing to talk about virtue and self-control, but it's so much better to practice it.
Mm,
It's better to be in the field doing that thing.
mm.
It's from a book of his, or a discourse called That One Should Disdain Hardships. And I think that's even at the root of a lot of the suffering that we have these days, is that people are in bondage to instant gratification because they're afraid of hardship.
True.
You know,
It's
and
it's
and
yeah, it's easier to say that I was just born this way rather than try to do the tough work of figuring out that maybe you weren't. That maybe
yeah,
there's something else going on. And I see this in families too. Families where there's like a lot of dysfunction or there's been abuse, and people will say, "Oh, so and so, they were just born that way." But then
yeah,
it gets everybody off the hook. And then I don't blame mom and dad, but a lot of times they're partly to blame. Then mom and dad, usually mom, is like, "Oh, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything. They were just born that way."
yeah, because it's so much easier to absolve your conscience by shifting the blame onto
Right.
the victim,
Right.
and then having the victim embrace that trauma as if it is some kind of
Oh God.
glorious identity.
Oh God, yeah.
It's like, and you see this even in straight people who've come out of abusive relationships or abusive households. I've seen it where they might be living a certain lifestyle, in terms of the use of substances or other things, and they think that, hey, this is fine. I'm just me doing my thing, living on the edge. I've got this cool identity that goes with it. But at the end of the day, you're defined by something that you're doing that only gives you a temporary reprieve. It doesn't really address what is going on the inside, that
Mm.
somebody hurt you, you're hurting, and that's the thing I tell people, because at times young men, when they come into the faith, they get a little too fiery, and then they want to condemn. But a lot of the time, when people fall into that habit of wanting to condemn and either heresy hunt, or
Mm.
kind of take this very strong,
Mm.
against the grain kind of polemic, a lot of the time they're actually casting aspersions and judgments that they themselves know really should apply to them, but it's
Yeah.
easier to externalize it rather than face it within.
True.
It's easier to blame someone else for your problems than it is to say, "Hey,
True.
I've got a problem. I'm in pain. Somebody help me."
True. This is on page 256. I'm going to try to wind this down with Father because I've kept him too long.
Ah,
We
don't worry about
must
it.
put a
It's good.
we
It's been a great talk.
thank you. We must put a stop to the actual committing of sin. As long as the senses are functioning carnally, self-knowledge is impossible. And I put in my notes, this is when sin becomes an identity. It's very hard
I think
to
that's really succinct. Yeah.
untangle yourself because when you're in that, trapped in that, enslaved, bound, bondage, whatever, to it, self-knowledge is really hard.
Oh yeah.
I think it's impossible.
It is, because you're kind of rooted in place, right? To kind of clarify to some who, because you said a good amount of your viewers are not Orthodox, or
Mhm.
maybe not even Christian.
Yeah.
Sin doesn't mean like, oh, woo bad, you're a criminal. Let's attach a accusation or a label of criminality. It's not necessarily that. What sin actually is, it comes from a Greek word meaning to miss the mark. Well, for us Christians, obviously the highest good, the highest mark is Christ. That's
Mhm.
who we as Christians, even with our name implies this, are trying to follow. When we sin and we miss that mark, we go to the wayside. If the aim is life and we miss the target of life, we're careening towards the cliffs that lead us to death. Just as, if I'm aiming for a target and I miss it, I might hit something or someone that I don't want to hit. Um, and that's what happens a lot of the time in our lives, is we sin through various weird little things. Most of the time, it's something that we're oblivious to, because we're not paying attention, and we lack
Mhm.
that self-awareness, right? So it's,
Mhm.
and by the way, just so people know, carnal sin doesn't just mean like sex and
Yeah.
lust and pornography, or
Right.
or addiction to drugs or alcohol. Another carnal sin that St. Ignatius Brianchaninoff points out in the field is anger.
Oh boy.
Anger is a carnal sin.
Oh, that's not good.
It's
It,
appetitive, right? Now, anger, when
yeah.
it's properly formed, should be directed towards the passions. So our anger should really be first, not so much to the point where we're so angry at ourselves that we want to hurt ourselves, but where we're angry enough with ourselves to reject the thing that's trying to attach to us. So it's supposed to be, I believe, what he calls the incisive power of the soul, right? This is what we're supposed to direct towards the passions, the devil, and say, hey, get out of my head. You're garbage. You don't belong here.
Yeah.
Versus, hey, that person's garbage. They don't belong here. Like, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter who you're dealing with. You have to have love for your neighbor. You have to have
Yeah.
compassion for them. It's one thing to judge an act or a way of doing things, versus to actually try to incisively target them with the anger, and because that becomes carnal for the person struggling with the anger. It's
Yeah.
your blood is pumping, you're getting hot, your heart
I,
rate's elevated.
I struggle with anger, and I notice a lot of people that either have been traumatized or abused, and then that leads into mental illness. And then a lot of times you see certain people that may be on the news or on TV or on YouTube or Twitter that are very angry. And when I see that anger is a lot of pain in those people. I'm not
Anger's
excusing what they do, but I'm just trying
no.
to explain it.
I think that's a really good dimension to keep in mind with this, is that it's a lot of pain. And, my mom once said something really wise to me when I was a kid. I was really angry about something. A friend of mine had really, hurt my trust in them. And I was really young and I was super, super mad. And my mom just looked at me and I remember saying, honey, you got to realize that this anger isn't that you want to go and hurt this person. Anger is oftentimes a deep sense of grief.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. But your mom's smart. She said that?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Wow.
She's fortunately she's got really, really bad dementia, but
I'm sorry.
oh, it's okay. No, she's devout still as an Orthodox Christian. She loves going to church. Um,
Wow.
but she had incredible wisdom.
I should
There's
say
this,
so.
yeah. And when I thought about that, I was like, you're right. I'm not so much angry that I want to hurt this person. I'm hurting. I'm in pain. And I don't know how to do this because obviously I'm looking for justice, right? And a lot of the time that anger in response to something is usually, people have an ingrained sense of justice. And a lot of people have been traumatized. They're angry because they're crying out for
Yeah,
justice. They want
it's
they
true.
want things balanced out. They don't necessarily want to destroy the person. They might feel that way. It's not necessarily what they want. What they really want is they want their peace restored. They want their safety restored. They want that identity to be kept intact as to who they are. Because when violence is done against us, it goes against what is natural to us. It's when we suffer violence, it makes us feel disconnected.
Amen. Okay, so my last few minutes, Father, I want to, how do we work on this and how do we heal? This is a good quote on page 259. St. John of the Ladder, who I'm not familiar with, but after reading this book, I really like him. St. John of the Ladder advises lay bare your wound to the healer. So first of all, reveal your wounds to Christ. That's the
Yeah.
first thing. And that sounds kind of easy. It's not that easy to do.
No, because with it comes bearing the cross too.
Oh
It,
my
it, it
God,
comes
Joe.
suffering. Even if you go to therapy, and this is like therapy for your soul when you come to Christ and when you start bearing your wounds to Him. But even when you go to therapy for any kind of trauma or past pain, you're going to have to relive it a little bit. You're going to have to go back into your heart, into your mind, and see these things. The difference is you're doing this to bring them to light, to be able to heal these wounds. And that's what we do with Christ, right? And it's hard. It's easy to think, okay, I can just talk and mouth it out. It's one thing to do that. It's another thing to start going through the actual process of turning it around, and that's painful. You have to bear your cross. So,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you didn't interrupt me. Now, on 267, he writes again, St. John of the Ladder. I like him. St.
He's
John of the
great.
Ladder writes that the remedy for all the passions is humility. Oh boy.
Yes.
And then this turned to something that I found from St. Porphyrios on page 94 for those who have this book. Let's see. In fact, the Christian religion transforms people and heals them. The most important precondition, however, for someone to recognize and discern the truth is humility.
Yeah, I have a problem. I need help.
Wow.
It's simple. And a lot of people they'll watch things like this and hope they're going to hear this really super mystically profound
It's not.
thing, but it's actually not. It's very simple. That's the beauty of it, right? Now it escapes our attention because we're creatures who love comfort. We love self-gratification. We love instant gratification. In fact, look at social media. It's the greatest propagator of that in our time because you can post a picture of yourself and immediately get likes and
Yeah.
comments and you see that this actually further harms humility, especially if someone's attractive and they get a lot of feedback about that. It harms humility. Um, so ultimately, what I would say is that the solution to all this is exactly as St. Paul says in Ephesians 5, when he says to look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise men, but as a wise man, making the most of time because the days are evil. And What does he mean by this? Well, wisdom is gained through experience and through humility. A wise person is not arrogant. Think of any image of a wise character, a wise man that you've either seen in media or known in your life, a wise woman. They're never arrogant or boastful, right? They're never unsure of themselves. Um, Saint Maximus the Confessor also said that one of our biggest problems, and this is actually in the article I'm writing as that I've written as well, and that's one of our biggest problems is that most of us are talkers and not doers. We'll talk
Mm.
about getting better, we'll talk about wanting to improve, and we might mean it, but then when it comes to the challenge, we don't raise to the challenge, right? And so it's so much harder to actually exercise the virtue you want to have when you're in a situation where you need that virtue. And so you have to kind of take that moment and that gap between receiving that input that's maybe getting you worked up or upset or really testing you. And in that little gap between receiving this circumstance and reacting to it, you have to remember that choice. You have to have that conviction, as St. Theophan the Recluse says, in your soul so that you react accordingly in a way that is going to be different from how you would react before. You have to change your behavior. And it's like I was saying earlier about Musonius Rufus. He said that it's of less significance and importance is to speak well of self-control than to practice self-control. You can speak
Mm.
well about it, you got to practice it. Right. And this is a Roman Stoic saying this. He wasn't even a Christian. Recalling the words of St. Paul, he said, every athlete, exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we can receive an imperishable one, right? That's when he says, "Well, I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I pummel my body and subdue it," right? Lest after preaching to others, I find myself disqualified, right? So it's ultimately what you got to do is you have to take action. You have to bear the crosses that you have. If you're struggling with an emotional disorder or mental illness, you have to embrace that as a struggle, but then you have to be willing to put in the hard work to not be defined by this, but to overcome it. And that's where most of us lose, is that our strength falters when it comes to that moment where
Mhm.
the doors of the ship have opened and now you're storming the beaches of Normandy. Are you going to charge forward? Or are you going to cower on the rampart and get gunned down? Your chances are much better if you just charge forward and start taking
Mhm.
charge.
Yeah.
I was told that every person who struggles with a mental or emotional issue, the first place that they'll go, especially if they're particularly introspective, is a bookstore. And that's a good start, but you got to start taking what's on the page and putting it out into reality, right?
Yeah. I think people get comfortable sometimes, and I don't think all mental illness is behavioral, but I think a lot of it is. And I think that was the case for me. I think it's the case for a lot of people that maybe had trauma or abuse. And unfortunately, it's a lot of people.
It
Um,
is.
yeah, it's not good. And I think what humility is, because I think a lot of people think, well, I'm humble, I'm nice to people, I'm not proud, I'm a humble person. But I think part and parcel of humility is like admitting when you've been wrong. And that's like the worst.
It's
Because
hard.
I know like I had invested like so much into like a life that I had lived. I had invested everything in it, my identity, everything, my life, my livelihood, everything. And then to even kind of come close to thinking about, well, maybe I was wrong about this, that takes a certain amount of humility. And I think humility comes upon people when they don't want it, because I think
Yeah.
a lot of, yeah, I think a
That's
lot
really
of,
well said.
yeah, I think a lot of people like get humble when they just like crash.
Yeah.
Because people often ask me, like, well, what is it going to take for so and so to like change or to like realize that they're involved in like bad stuff or addictions or like self-destruction, like bad scenes and bad people. And I usually go, it's like people like got to hit rock bottom. They gotta kind of have to crash. And like if you like find yourself like like alone and really just bottomed out, that brings like it's just like instant humility.
Yeah.
And that sometimes will
It's kind of
give
like
people
when you're like, holy, I'm
yeah,
responsible for this, and
yeah,
I've been blaming everyone else but me, and now I've got to be
yeah.
humble and eat my words and my actions, and
And it gives you it gives sometimes it gives you clarity. And I
yeah,
think that like it's so stupid, but it's like darkest before the dawn. But I think that's true. I think when people really are at their worst, I think that's when things can change. That's
yeah.
the opportunity.
I
And
I
then
love how you said that. I think that's true,
okay.
100%. I mean, when you're at your worst, that's usually when you start looking to become your best.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you can get pretty far, but Christ is going to be the one who takes you further, right? Because the thing is that you have to get to that point. If you want to be the best you can be, he's the one who's going to do it for you. I mean, look at him. He lived a perfect life. You read about him, even just in the Gospels. If you were just to read it objectively, what wrong? What thing did this man say that was bad or not applicable to your day-to-day life? That's the prime example to follow. And then, when he's faced with death, he shows his divinity and his nobility by accepting it out of love for everyone else. He even says there's no greater love than this, than to lay one's life down for his
Amen.
friends. And and we can all be his friends. We can be his friends because he even said, "You are my friends because you do as I command, as you obey me." And what is the ultimate overarching thing he tells us to do? To love one another, and of course to repent of our sins and to love
Mhm.
God in doing this, right?
Mhm.
And that's ultimately at the heart of it. And it's hard because we live in a world that tells us self-love is the highest love, but it can't be. It can't be. Self-love never goes beyond yourself, and if it doesn't, how can that be high? It can't be higher than anything. And maybe sometimes people get discouraged with Christianity because they think that it expects you to be perfect. This isn't true. Um, there's a beautiful quote from St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 that where he says that and this is of course he's quoting, this is Christ speaking through him, where he says, "My grace is sufficient for you, my strength is made perfect in weakness."
Mhm.
It's okay to be weak. Just don't stay there. You don't have to stay there. You don't have to be defined by your weakness.
Mhm.
You can be defined by your journey to strength from that weakness, right? When you look at the whole idea of the hero's journey, that's something my dad used to use in his counseling models when he was a family therapist. My dad was a counselor specializing in addictions and family counseling for over 30
Wow.
years. And it's kind of where I learned a lot of this stuff too. He always had kind of a couple scenarios. Like he would tell people to go to the movies and kind of, instead of visualizing all the things that they struggle to want to let go of, to struggle to visualize the things that they want to grab on to that will be better. That, like, for example, you had somebody who wanted to become a cop. You'd be like, okay, well, tell me, what does this process look like? Look at it from the point of view of a movie and ask yourself, is the way that you're living it right now a movie you're going to want to watch? Nobody wants to watch a hero's journey where the hero at the end of the day falls and fails to
Mhm.
do what he set out to do, right? That's not the whole point of the hero's journey. The hero's journey is starting from a point of weakness, going through struggles and trials in order to win the prize, right? And usually the prize is the safety of others, or it's something that inevitably moves outside of the hero's focus of himself and onto something greater. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize, is that they have that potential to become heroes for Christ, that they can become warriors for God.
Wow. That's pretty awesome. Thank you, Father.
No worries.
One couple last quotes. This is where he quotes heavily from Saint Gregory on the holy hesychast, known as the triads. One who has cleared his soul of all connection with things of the world, who has detached himself from everything by keeping the commandments and by the dispassion that this brings, and who has passed beyond all cognitive activity through continuous, sincere, and immaterial prayer, and who has been abundantly illuminated by the inaccessible light in an inconceivable union, he alone becoming light, contemplating by the light, and beholding the light in the vision and enjoyment of this light, recognizes truly that God is transcendently radiant and beyond comprehension. He glorifies God not wholly beyond his Noosa's human power of understanding. For many created things are beyond that, but even beyond that marvelous union, which is the only means by which the Nous is united with what is beyond intelligible things, imitating divinely this was a hard word for me, supra celestial noetic powers. That's pretty awesome.
I
Now
was just going to say you did just fine.
okay, and then this one quote from Saint Porphyrios. I don't know why I have a block with that.
It's not a common name that we usually
I
speak
know. Oh,
in
it's
English.
Greek too.
Yeah,
So
Porphyrios.
it's a
Yeah,
hard one for me. Let's see.
yeah,
When you try to escape these two quotes, I don't know, they seem similar to me. When you try to escape from the old self without the gift of grace, you are drawn into it and experience that old self. But with the gift of grace, however, it no longer concerns you. It continues to exist deep down. All things remain within us, ugly things included. They do not disappear, but with grace, however, they are transubstantiated, altered, and transformed. Isn't this what St. Basil's prayer of the ninth hour says? So that setting aside the old man, we may be put on the new man and live with you, our master. So
yes,
it's like the whole person is transformed. I thought with those two quotes.
exactly.
Yes.
It's kind of funny because the church has always understood that the transformation of the whole person happens on every level. It happens on the physical, the mental, the spiritual. Um, you
That's
see a lot of people see like, oh, you get guys like, and they're great, but guys like Andrew Huberman, and they're like, he's teaching us how to get to the mind through the body. Dude, we've been doing that since like 33 AD.
yeah.
We've been teaching people that through asceticism. And but I am glad that a lot of people are discovering this because this is an opportunity for them to maybe clear some of the other stuff out of their lives so that they can come to more, they can have more. Um, yeah, you have to start by, what do you do with your body? What are you doing in terms of the things you're maybe giving into that you shouldn't give into, the self-control, and then that can help you get to the mind, but then you still have to get to the spiritual aspect and realize, well, there's something behind just my mind, just my brain, which is really a part of your body. There's something behind the brain. There's something behind the mind. There's a spiritual reality kind of driving all of this. There's something more that is driving me to live the way I'm living and why I want to live, what I want to live for. What is my purpose? And that's ultimately what we're all seeking is purpose. And for those of us who find Christ, we find that purpose in something higher than us. It's St. Gregory said it beautifully in that quote that you shared, where we that understanding that yes, God is transcendental, He's transcendent above all things, but that love for God comes from how He reveals Himself to us, and through
Mm,
that we come to know Him, and by coming to know Him, we can rightly love Him, and when we start to love Him, we start to want to serve Him because again, it's like I said, love can't just be this internalized thing where it's like, oh, it's just my personal relationship, it's just my truth. It can't be personal. Love is not a personal thing. Love has to be something that we realize is, in fact, universal in the sense that St. Maximus says, right? It has to apply to more than just yourself because self-love is the highest form of madness.
mm. Thank you, Father. I encourage people to read the book. I actually the title seems really like tough,
Yeah,
like intimidating Orthodox psychotherapy. But
but it's
actually,
very accessible.
yeah, I found it pretty easy to well, I should say easy to read, but I found it that I could understand it, and I took little pieces of it at a time. And like I did with Father here, although I took too much of his time,
No.
is that I just took one little piece of it where I kind of thought maybe where mental illness is being caused by people being enslaved to their passions, that might have been connected to childhood abuse or trauma. That was just like one little piece of it that I tried to so but I think there's a lot of things in this book where people can kind of, maybe to relate to that I related to that part. But it's really good. I like it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it can be a tough read because maybe you're gonna it might make you look at yourself in a way that you hadn't before, and that's okay. It's good for us
Yeah,
to be challenged, right? Like if you get angry, if you get upset by certain things, always pause and ask where is it coming from first, and then try to work your way through it and use it as an opportunity, right? And use the book as a lens, but ultimately, go to church, go see a priest and have a good conversation, and
true.
do what you got to do to probe deeper.
I think like this book, and I'll shut up. I think like this book is that Orthodoxy has a real holistic approach.
Oh yeah,
I think,
it's the whole man, the whole person.
yeah, and I don't know why other Christian religions haven't done that. They just haven't done it. But
Well, I think it's actually summed up by what Metropolitan Hierotheos said, and that's when you lose the correct belief, the correct theology, you
oh,
lose the therapeutic method.
oh, okay, that's it. Okay, thank you, Father.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's not
And
saying we're better or anything like that. It's
no,
just,
but hey,
look at
if
Christian history.
it works, if it works, it works.
Yeah.
And yeah. Uh, and thank you, Father, for taking up so much of your time. I appreciate it.
Honestly, I'm thanking you because this was a blessing to come and talk. Like, you've made a lot of good connections and good points. Like, this was a great blessing for me too. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Father.